Hey guys, what's going on? Blaine back for another Disney Plus review, and today I'm going to be talking about Pinocchio. Pinocchio is the latest in a series of live-action remakes from Disney's catalog of animated classics, and tells the story of Pinocchio, a wooden puppet carved by his maker Geppetto. He's brought to life by the power of the Blue Fairy, who promises to make him a real boy if he in turn promises to prove himself to be brave, truthful, and selfless. He tries to live life by these principles, but his naivete causes problems in doing so. This leads him to explore various temptations that stray him from his path, while attempting to stay focused on following his conscience, with the help of his friend Jiminy Cricket. I made sure to rewatch the original version from 1940 to refresh my memory before going into this review, and it was definitely an interesting experience watching these movies back to back. As for this modern version, while there are things I like about it, it just can't hold a candle to the original. It does a decent enough job at retelling the same story everyone knows and loves, but that's about it. It has the same lack of inspiration as most of Disney's other recent remakes, to the point where I question why it was even remade in the first place. To begin with, Pinocchio is more or less the same character that everyone was familiar with in the original. He's still naive and overly trusting of everyone he meets, regardless of whether they have good or bad intentions, and this makes sense due to him initially being a blank slate with no initial concept of right or wrong. His childlike sense of curiosity for the world around him is both adorable, especially once his adventure kicks off and he makes use of his abilities as a puppet, and makes the audience worry for his safety when he gets mixed up with the wrong crowd. It also helps that he's a child character who's voiced by an actual child, Benjamin Evan Ainsworth, and he does a fantastic job in coming as close to emulating the original voice as possible. I've noticed a lot of animated movies these days tend to have child characters voiced by adults, which I've always found easy to spot and kind of immersion breaking, but in this movie's case, Pinocchio's voice works very well. One thing I noticed about how Pinocchio was portrayed in this version was how much it emphasized how much he wasn't a real boy. I'm not opposed to the movie doing this, but for some reason it really loves driving this point home and yet not really going anywhere with it. Pinocchio keeps doing the same things as he did in the original version, while he and other characters ruminate over him not being a real boy, but the payoff just isn't there. I kept waiting for some sort of emotional climax where Pinocchio realizes he's not like other kids and him being devastated by this, and it never happens. Some of the problem in this regard lies in how other characters are portrayed, the most important of which is Geppetto, who's played by Tom Hanks. Now, I just want to go on record and say that I think Hanks' casting as Geppetto was a stroke of genius. The way he conveys his gentle demeanor and mannerisms toward others makes him the perfect father figure and role model for a child like Pinocchio to follow. However, I found his depressing backstory in this version to be a very odd narrative choice. From what I gathered, he appears to mourn the loss of his wife Constanza and his son, and he wants to make a replica of said son so that he can avoid feeling lonely. It's natural that Geppetto would have loneliness, but in this movie's case they made it way too obvious. The original 1940 Geppetto was still lonely, but this was made much more clear without having so much exposition bogging down the story. The effort to flesh out Geppetto's background is admirable, but his family is never referenced again outside of this opening scene, so in the end, all it did was create a weird tonal shift that clashes with the rest of the movie. Getting back to my earlier point though about Pinocchio's lack of effective build-up, the relationship between him and Geppetto is sort of half-baked. I did like that they have a few scenes of them having fun together in the beginning, as it shows them building their family bond. Once the opening act is out of the way though, it feels like Geppetto disappears for much of the second act and doesn't have much of anything to do. It just feels unnecessarily rushed, whereas by comparison, almost the entire first act in the original takes place in Geppetto's shop, which provides plenty of time for Pinocchio to get accommodated to his life and the world around him. And for as big of a deal as Geppetto makes out Pinocchio's lack of realness to be at first, he never seems all that bothered by it later on. The way his arc finishes as he comes to terms with Pinocchio's realness doesn't feel satisfying, and only does the bare minimum in capturing the essence of the father-son dynamic they're supposed to have. Jiminy Cricket was another character that ended up being a mixed bag. Joseph Gordon-Levitt does a phenomenal job in voicing the role, once again almost perfectly emulating the enthusiasm of the original voice as was done with Pinocchio, and the little chirping noises he makes as he jumps around in scenes was a pretty cute touch. The main problem with Jiminy in this movie is the same with Geppetto. He's supposed to have a larger role than he actually does, with being the conscience that helps Pinocchio learn what's good and bad and to make sense of his realness. And while there is some of that, it just doesn't feel as prominent as it did in the original. The movie is also a little bit on the nose as far as labeling Jiminy as the narrator goes. This was evident right from the get-go in the original without needing to spell it out like this version does, and in general he just had a much bigger presence in that movie, so his role as a narrator there is more consistent, whereas in this version he keeps getting shafted to the wayside. The rest of the other animal characters are also pretty disappointing in their execution. Geppetto's pet fish Cleo is okay for the most part, but his cat Figaro lacks any personality that his original counterpart had. This is likely a consequence of the movie opting for a photorealistic look with its visuals, but even then, the way he behaves here is so ordinary, he's pretty much just a regular cat. Honest Jack and Gideon return in this movie as well, and like with other characters, are simply watered down shadows of their former selves. Keegan-Michael Key does a great job voicing Jack, and the gags with Gideon are funny, but as usual their roles, this time being the forces of temptation meant to lead Pinocchio astray, are diluted in approach, and they aren't even in the movie as often as one might expect. There's also a brand new character inserted into the story named Fabiana, along with her puppet Sabina, and she basically feels like an unnecessary secondary version of Jiminy Cricket. I didn't understand why they made her character have these heart-to-hearts with Pinocchio when they could have just as easily been done with Jiminy instead. I get that she's meant to be another reason to prove to Pinocchio to not follow his temptations, and it is kind of nice to have another character involved in the Stromboli storyline, but she never contributed that much in the grand scheme of things. Pretty much everything she can do, Jiminy does better, even in this version. There's also this seagull named Sophia who mostly exists to point characters in the right direction whenever the plot calls for it. Outside of this, she does little more than provide a few comedic lines of dialogue that are only good for a laugh or two. I know I'm nitpicking and complaining a lot, but it's really annoying to see all these little problems compounding on top of each other with memorable characters who were already established, let alone adding the mediocrity of the new ones on top of it all. But with that being said, there are some things that it gets right with the characters. The Blue Fairy's role actually makes more sense in this version, with Geppetto making a proper wish that leads to her appearing and granting it. Beyond this, I appreciated that she didn't appear much in the movie itself, as it lended more of a mystique to her character and not making her out to be some sort of babysitter to help Pinocchio when he's in need. Other scenes from the original version are portrayed better here as well, with the search for Geppetto after Pinocchio escapes Pleasure Island being a prime example. As much as I love the underwater visuals of the original, it was pretty boring seeing Pinocchio and Jiminy stumble about underwater, so it was good to see a more sensible way of the pair reuniting in this version. As much as I might complain about the story, the movie does sound and look faithful to its original counterpart. The soundtrack is definitely the better of the two qualities, with whimsical song and dance sequences that are choreographed well and featuring a variety of old favorites and surprisingly catchy new tunes. In terms of visuals, it looks fine in general, mostly due to the quality of the CG animation. It's pretty on par from what one could expect from a big budget Disney movie, but it's still pretty cool to see it take more advantage of Pinocchio's nature as a puppet this time around. I always got a kick of seeing him twist and turn and just moving about in his environment. Even so, the movie loses some of its artistic appeal just by virtue of its live-action setting. The original version had beautiful painted backdrops and special effects that coalesced well with the hand-drawn characters and detailed objects, and even had little nifty editing techniques that looked visually distinctive. This live-action version does look nice, but nice is just about the only word I can think of. The costumes in the Italian village are appealing to look at, but they don't have the same wow factor as the original. The only set designs that stood out to me were the ones from Pleasure Island, which admittedly look stunning, and aside from this, everything else was just slightly above average. One thing that annoyed me about the visuals though was the way the big whale Monstro was portrayed. I remember being terrified of the original version as a kid, and it was because of how deceptively simple it looked on the surface, yet how menacing and demented it ended up being. In this version though, instead of being a normal whale, he looks like some sort of dinosaur / Cthulhu nightmare hybrid, and it doesn't make any sense. The rest of the movie's visuals are mostly grounded in reality, so this ugly design sticks out like a sore thumb. As far as comedy goes, it mostly consists of iffy lines, especially whatever comes out of Honest Jack's mouth, and rehashing old gags from the original version. It is kind of amusing to see a more modern spin on these jokes, but at the same time, it's a bit tiring when one already knows the punchline behind them. It also has the same message about following one's conscience and avoiding temptation, just with a lot less subtlety this time around. I feel like Disney doesn't trust its audience to interpret its messages, so it has to lay everything out for them, but it does so in the most uninspired way possible. Going off topic a bit, I'm a bit puzzled as to why Disney even bothers making these remakes, other than the obvious money reason. Almost all of them end up changing what doesn't need to be changed and do a disservice to the original, and this movie exemplifies this to a T. Overall, Disney's Pinocchio is a bland adaptation that, while not terrible, fails to recapture the magic of the original. If you like Disney movies and you've been itching to watch another remake of a classic, you might enjoy this to some extent, or you may feel it's a disgrace. It could go either way. The weakly written characters and plot are supported by its colorful presentation and musical sequences, but only just. If anything, the mediocrity of this movie goes to show how much more impressive it makes a movie released 80 plus years ago look by comparison. What did you think about this movie? Do you think it was a worthy adaptation, or were you also disappointed by it? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways guys, that's going to wrap up my review of Disney's Pinocchio. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always stay tuned for the next part, where next time I review the American thriller End of the Road. Bye bye!